So today, we're diving deep into what has to be one of the most pivotal periods in the entire New Testament. We're looking at what Matthew's gospel basically calls the year of popularity. This is the time when Jesus' fame just explodes and he's attracting these massive crowds. But what's really fascinating here is that the very things that make him a superstar are also planting the seeds for some intense opposition and honestly a pretty shocking turn in his mission.
To really get why Jesus' message landed with such incredible force, we have to look at who he was talking to. The source describes the people as just spiritually starving. They felt lost, completely neglected by their religious leaders. It paints this picture of a people who were, and this is a direct quote, harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. So that really sets the stage for a figure who doesn't just talk, but who acts with real compassion and authority.
Okay, so to put all this into context, his public ministry is often broken down into this 3-year arc. Year 1, that was all about proclaiming his message. And year 3, well, that was defined by some pretty intense opposition. We're going to zero in on that critical middle year, the year of popularity. This is the absolute peak of his public acclaim, and it's the turning point for the whole story.
So what exactly lit the fuse for this explosion of popularity? Well, it all kicked off with his teaching, specifically the Sermon on the Mount. The source tells us the crowds were just astonished because, and I quote, "He taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law." This was something completely new. It was direct and it was powerful.
And believe me, his authority wasn't just in his words. Let's look at this one key story that shows just how far his fame had spread. You have a Roman centurion, we're talking a military officer, an occupier, a total outsider, who comes up to Jesus. And he's desperate. His servant is back at home, paralyzed and in absolute agony.
Jesus actually offers to go to the man's house, but what the centurion says next is, well, it's incredible. He stops him. He says, "Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." See, this guy understood authority. He knew that someone with real power doesn't need to be physically present to get something done. He saw a divine authority in Jesus that just went beyond space and distance.
Jesus' reaction tells you everything. He's genuinely amazed by this outsider's faith. And then, just as the centurion believed, his servant is healed, instantly, from miles away. Now, a demonstration of power like that, over sickness and distance, that is exactly the kind of thing that turns a popular teacher into a phenomenon.
But not everyone was impressed. And this is where you really start to see two distinct camps forming. On one hand, you have the general public, the crowds. They were totally amazed. They were saying things like, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But on the other hand, the religious establishment, the Pharisees, they were getting jealous and hostile, seeing him as a major threat to their own authority.
So as his popularity grew, so did the opposition. And right around this time, his teaching style starts to shift. While he's performing these huge public miracles, Jesus begins teaching in a totally different way. He starts using parables, these short, symbolic stories that were definitely not as straightforward as they seemed on the surface.
And that is the million-dollar question, right? It's the same thing his own disciples asked him. I think we all kind of assume that parables are just simple little stories to make a complex idea easier to understand. But the source material reveals a much more surprising, almost counterintuitive reason.
The parables were, in a way, a filter. For people who were genuinely seeking, the stories would open up and reveal these deep truths about his kingdom. But for the curious, the skeptical, or the outright hostile, the meaning would stay hidden. They were a tool for both revelation and concealment, basically forcing you to decide if you were really in or out.
The parable of the 4 soils is the perfect case study for this. So the seed is the message of the kingdom, right? And it's sown everywhere, on everyone. But the outcome depends entirely on the soil, which is the heart of the person hearing it. For some, the message gets snatched away. For others, it withers under pressure or gets choked out by worries. It's only the good soil, the receptive heart, that actually produces a harvest. So the parable really puts the responsibility right back on the listener.
And this whole idea of having a receptive heart, of choosing to be an insider, well, it wasn't a casual decision. The source makes it crystal clear that following Jesus demanded a radical, all-in commitment. There was a real cost involved. And there is no better example of this than the calling of Matthew himself, the guy who wrote this gospel. Tax collectors back then were despised, sure, but they also had really secure, well-paying jobs. When Jesus just looks at him and says, "Follow me," Matthew gets up, leaves his entire career behind, and follows him. Just like that, instantly. That's the level of commitment that was being asked. Of course, the religious leaders were absolutely horrified that Jesus was hanging out with people like Matthew. But when they criticized him for eating with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus gives this powerful mission statement. He says he wasn't there for the people who thought they already had it all figured out. He was there for the outcasts, the messy, the broken.
So all of this, the insane popularity, the secret teachings, this radical call to follow him, it's all building to a huge climax. It happens at a place called Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus finally pushes his disciples to declare who they really think he is. And wow, it leads to one of the most shocking reversals in the entire story.
He starts off with a pretty general question, almost like he's taking a temperature check of public opinion. He's basically asking, so, what's the word on the street? What are the crowds saying about me?
And the answer showed that people knew he was special. I mean, they were comparing him to the greatest figures in their history. John the Baptist come back to life, the legendary prophet Elijah. They knew he was a great prophet, but they still hadn't quite grasped the full picture.
And then he pivots. He makes it personal. He makes it direct. He looks right at his inner circle, the ones who had literally left everything to follow him, and asks the most important question yet. This is the moment of truth.
And it's Simon Peter who speaks up, making this monumental declaration. He's not just calling him a prophet, he is identifying him as the Christ, the Messiah, the long-awaited Savior, and the Son of God. This is the absolute high point of recognition in his entire ministry.
In response, Jesus affirms Peter's confession, saying he will build his church on this rock of revelation. But then, almost in the next breath, the narrative takes a whiplash-inducing turn. When Jesus starts to explain that being the Christ means he has to suffer and die, Peter actually rebukes him, and Jesus' response is just stunning. He goes from calling Peter the rock of the church to saying, "Get behind me, Satan," in a matter of moments.
So, with his identity and his destiny now out in the open, Jesus begins to lay out a blueprint for this new community he called the church. And no surprise, the rules for how it would operate were just as radical and countercultural as everything else he did.
When his disciples start arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, Jesus completely flips the whole concept of power on its head. The path to greatness, he says, isn't through ambition or status. It's through humility, becoming like a child, someone with no power. It's through serving others. The one who wants to be first has to be the slave of everyone else.
And what about conflict inside this community? Well, Peter, probably thinking he's being really generous, asks if he should forgive someone 7 times. And Jesus gives an even more radical answer. He says no, not 7 times, but 77 times. And the source notes this number signifies a forgiveness that is totally limitless, unending, without keeping score.
And all of that leaves us with the central question of this entire period. This story shows us a figure who had the crowds in the palm of his hand. He could have leveraged that popularity for power and influence in any way he chose. And yet, at the absolute peak of his fame, he deliberately turns toward a path that he knows will lead to suffering, rejection, and ultimately death. Why? That's the tension that hangs over the rest of the story.